is Pepe Rossy, and I'll be interpreting for Professor Evarina Deulofeu. I work with a local kind of newborn group that's been organizing for Cuba. We had a couple of events a couple of weeks ago about the Cuban Five. We're holding this, and we'll be holding some other events. So one of the things that we would like to do is pass around the sign-up sheet, and if you would like to either receive Dr. Deulofeu's presentation as an email attachment or a paper that she wrote on this that I believe now we have an English language version, and you give us your full information, we'll be glad to send that to you. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to present the introductory part of her presentation, and now it's down to about 15 slides. And then we'll open it up for Evarina to make some comments, particularly about the more recent changes in the campaign to eradicate homophobia from Cuba. It's a fascinating event, a fascinating process, and for me, every time I go to Cuba, so much has changed, and this is one of the more fascinating changes. As you'll see, it's an evolution of the Cuban Revolution towards a process of a more egalitarian society that began with an opening campaign against sexism, a campaign against racism, the development of the Federation of Cuban Women, and in turn, some of the early, to speak honestly, some of the early days of the revolution, they were frankly repressive, and frankly, they institutionalized homophobia in some of the early years of the revolution. And in a way, in the late 70s, Fidel spoke about that was one of our mistakes. And I think the Cuban Revolution, one of the refreshing things is that they've been very willing to acknowledge their mistakes. The speech was called, "Today we're going to speak about our problems." And that's something they've done, de nuestros errores, about our mistakes, and that's something that we've done. So in the 70s, Fidel, on behalf of the Cuban government, acknowledged some of the mistakes in the revolution. And since then, there's been a process, a fascinating process, that has accelerated in over the past 10 years, led by CENESEX, the Center for Sex Education in Cuba, under the leadership of Mariel Castro. That process has been accelerated, and again, I'll summarize that process, and then Evarina will tell us more about it. Evarina chose to start with this quote from Jose Marti, one of the founding fathers of Cuba, because Jose Marti's thought and action it remains the guiding course of the revolution. As Latin America and the Caribbean, our countries have been framed once and again on global maps of capitalism as a region always subordinate and to be exploited, should have been. And that's a quote from Evarina, a statement from Evarina, and it presents the framework. Cuba has gone through to 4 revolutions in a relatively short period. The first 2 revolutions, the wars of independence, the struggle for independence from Spain, the first and second wars of independence. Later in the 1930s, a struggle to make Cuba a progressive democratic nation, later overthrown by the Batista dictatorship. And then the revolution that we're more concerned about today, the current revolution that goes on, the 1959 Cuban Revolution. There are 4 political currents that have been always present in Cuba, and for me as Puerto Rican this sounds very familiar, because we have had the same currents in Puerto Rico without attaining, as they have, their ultimate stage of independence, but it speaks of reform, annexation, and first annexation was annexation to Spain, and later on their on their American colonialism, there was, in fact, the first president of Cuba after the Spanish-American War was supporting the annexation of Cuba to the United States, and finally for true independence. And in that process, again, it is guided by the thoughts and actions of Jose Marti's dream. And this is a quote from Jose Marti that is often quoted by the leadership of Cuba. But it speaks, this is 1892. So even while fighting Spanish colonialism, Jose Marti, this amazing poet, leader, man of action and of ideas, who died in combat, even while fighting against Spanish colonialism, was already thinking ahead about what are the concerns that we must have. And so he says, to prevent the United States, the fundamental struggle, objective of our struggle is to prevent the United States from spreading through the Antilles as Cuba gains its independence, and from overpowering with that additional strength our lands of America. Everything that I have done up until now, and everything that I will do, is to this end. And it's in that sense, again, that the Cuban government has continued the thoughts and philosophy of Jose Marti. Marti's ideas about the kind of institutions that he would like to see in Cuba were based on 4 fundamental principles. It says Americanism, and Evarina and I debated, should we change it to meaning Latin Americanism? And I said, no, you know, when I used to teach at City University, I was in the curriculum committee, and every time that somebody was proposing some changes to, or a new course on American history, I would ask whether they were going to speak of Jose Sucre and San Martin and Bolivar. And I said, what? And of course, they said, oh yeah, you with the old story about how it should be United States history and not American history. Well, it is, and that was the thought of Marti. It was a Pan-Americanism, a perspective of Pan-Americanism. That's why we got that asterisk there. A thought based on anti-imperialism, again, first against the Spanish Empire, the popular concept of insurrection, real mass, grassroots-based action. At that time, the struggle was against slavery, for the abolition of slavery and for independence, and so that many of the Mambises that joined the Cuban Revolution against Spain were slaves or former slaves, and to develop an egalitarian republic. And we'll see how this plays out in these movements towards increasing, to make the revolution increasingly welcoming of diverse thoughts, of diverse ways of being. And Evarina and her husband, along with many others, have been very important in this struggle towards building a more egalitarian society. We're hoping that Evarina will be here today with her husband, Reverend Raul Suarez, an amazing man in his own right. The U.S. Department denied him a visa, but Raul Suarez and Evarina have been part of this movement, first an opening towards religion, and they have been very influential in this process of an opening towards religion. As I said, it's a process of gradual inclusion of other groups that have been marginalized in the early days of the revolution, or to make Cuba a much more, to reduce the inequities, to reduce the marginalization of increasing segments of the population. And Raul Suarez was very much involved in the process when he was president of the Cuban Ecumenical Council in the 80s to negotiate an opening towards religion, and they succeeded. They even got Cuba to change its constitution. The Cuban constitutions defined the state of Cuba as an atheist state, and through the efforts of Raul, Evarina, many others, it evolved into, they actually changed the constitution to redefine Cuba no longer as an atheist state, but as a secular state. Likewise, they also managed to get not only the Cuban constitution changed, but they also managed to change the constitution of the Communist Party that decreed originally that in order to be a member of the Communist Party, you had to be an atheist, that religious people, whether we're speaking of the Afro-Cuban religions or the Christian religions or Jews, religions of any sort, if you were religious, you could not be member of the Cuban Communist Party. All that is over and done with, thanks to the efforts of them, along with many other people. Today, Raúl Suárez was originally the first member of the Asamblea Nacional de Poderes Populares, the Poder Popular, their parliament, the National Assembly of People's Power. He was the first member of the assembly. It's kind of the equivalent of their Senate. And he was the first member of the assembly, deputy of the assembly, who was not a member of the Communist Party. Raúl defines himself as an uncomfortable friend of the revolution, a term that some of us can sometimes embrace. Today he remains a member of the assembly, of again, the Cuban parliament, but he's no longer the only one who's not a member of the Communist Party. And it shows that, that opening. And the last fundamental principle, one of democratic formation, which is, again, these are the bases that continue to guide the ideology of the Cuban Revolution. So the Cuban Revolution, after a long struggle, managed to succeed to do a military takeover in 1959, January 1st, 1959. The dictator Batista will flee. He fled with $400 million of the treasury. And so it was a triumph of the revolution, the beginning of this process of change, a change at all levels, a very remarkable process of the kind that we've seen very few in history, that involved the changing of people in every sphere of human endeavor, of human relations, in the economy, the social life, and as we'll see also in terms of changing culture, which is, again, what Evarina's presentation is about, changing culture now towards eradicating sexism, which is a struggle that continues, as any Cuban woman would tell you, and some men as well as the process of eradicating homophobia. The achievements of the revolution are well known, so I want we only summarize just a few. Mortality, infant mortality in 1959 was abominable. It was at the rate of 60 per thousand live births. Today, that figure is 4.7, 4.8 per thousand live births. The comparable rate for the United States is 5.9 per thousand live births. Besides the changes in healthcare, one of the early campaigns of the revolution was a campaign against illiteracy. And there, the Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, Cuban Federation of Women, played a leading role, the leading role, in fact, in this campaign. So in 1958, roughly 1 out of every 3 Cubans was illiterate. There were hundreds of thousands of children without school. There were tens of thousands of unemployed teachers. Today, 99% of Cubans can read and write. It's the same rate as in the United States of 99%, and 100% of the Cuban children attend school, and there are no unemployed teachers in Cuba. So, but from the earliest days, the Cuban Revolution included women at all levels and every role. And this in turn has affected quite an influence in the erosion of the traditionally patriarchal, misogynist, frankly, society that existed in Cuba prior to. And we see this from the earliest days. In the Moncada attack, we see the role of Aide Santa Maria, Mel Bernandez, who took place, this is in 1956. I put the wrong date. It should be in July 26, 1956. A failed attack on the Moncada garrison in Santiago de Cuba, where we see women not just as members, but actually as leaders of the assault. The Granma expedition and the early days of the guerrilla, we see some very prominent women. They were not the only ones, but these women were not just there and present, they were leaders of the movement. Celia Sanchez, after all, was on the beach trying to signal, organizing the reception of the Granma They landed in the wrong place. There were no GPS back then. But Celia was on the beach waiting to receive, with weapons and trucks, to receive the Granma expedition. And we see often pictures, I think I actually put a picture here, of, well, yeah. ¿Quiénes son esas? Aide es esta, ¿verdad? La de, well, actually I think it says there.
Aide.
Yeah, Aide is in the front.
Aide lleva es la que lleva el fusil.
So Aide is in the front, Celia is behind her.
Está aquí, y es la segunda detrás de Aide.
Right, the second one. And on the right we see in the center
Celia y Vilma Espín.
Celia and Vilma Espín along with Fidel and Raúl. But we see this, so again, from the early days, and this in turn is one of those factors, one of these forces that is going to affect changes in the conception of women, that women were there, that they were combatants. In fact, Aide Santa Maria and Celia Sanchez had been fighting a shooting war prior to Che or Fidel or Camilo shooting taking a single shot in part of the revolution. Skipping over to today, women back in 1953 represented about 12% of the labor force, and when we look back, at 12% can be misleading. These were in some menial roles in the economy. Today, they represent 46% of the state employees. They used to comprise 3%. Oops, somebody didn't translate this one. So I just wanted to see if you were to test your Spanish. So women comprise 3% of the university graduates. Today, they comprise more than 60% of the university graduates and more than 63% of university students in contemporary Cuba. These are 2012 figures. And there it says that before Fidel, Che, and Camilo were fired a shot in the Sierra Maestra, Celia Sanchez and Aide Santa Maria were leading guerrilla attacks against Batista soldiers. So imagine the effect that this would have on a traditionally sexist, patriarchal, frankly misogynist society. And this will continue after the revolution under the threat of foreign attacks by the United States, not just the Bay of Pigs, but many ongoing attacks. Women then began to join in massive numbers, in tens of thousands, the armed forces of the revolution. In 1960, the first this was the very first mass organization after the triumph of the revolution. It was the foundation of the Federation of Cuban Women, with goals such as bringing women out of the home and into the economy, to reorganize peasant households, and to keep women in subservient roles, to develop communal services, to alleviate domestic work and childcare. And I'm going through these a little bit quickly because I like to make room for Evarina to address it and then for your questions. Again, the goals: to provide equal opportunities for women, to mobilize women into political work in government administration, to provide adequate working conditions to satisfy the particular needs of the female organism and the moral and spiritual needs of women as mothers. Today, 80% of women over 14 years of age are members of the Federation of Cuban Women. So, as I noted earlier, it's the FMC that was tasked with organizing the campaign against illiteracy. And there would be nearly 100,000 women and girls participated in this campaign. A campaign that meant these women and girls going to some of the most remote, rural parts of Cuba, and some of them were actually murdered by the counter-revolutionaries that were still supported by the CIA in the Sierra del Escambray and also in the east. They were still launching a resistance, a counter-revolutionary effort. They actually would murder some of the women and girls in the alphabetization campaign, the literacy campaign. It was an amazing effort. Within a little more than a year, Cuba was able to declare itself a territory free of illiteracy. These women and girls would be living in these communities all over the country, would be living with families and would be conducting classes during the day, at night, particularly with the women, but also with men, in community centers, in households. An amazing effort which speaks to how Cuba can mobilize its population towards these ends of really changing culture, which again is what's happening now with the campaign against homophobia. And we see that that of the newly alphabetized, the newly literate, 55% of the newly literate Cubans, or about 700,000 of them, were women. Women today, these are 2011 figures, constitute 51% of the scientists and 48% of the research scientists. There are 2/3 of professional technical workers in state civil service. In 1953, there were 6% of all MDs, of medical doctors, were women. Today, women constitute 56% of all medical doctors in Cuba and 52% of all healthcare workers in Cuba. Continuing with the progress of women, today, women constitute 43% of the Assembly, National Assembly of People's Power. Like I said, their parliament, their highest elected office. And I put the figure by comparison. About 20% of the United States Senate are women. About 70% of district attorneys are women, and life expectancy for women is 20 years more than it was in 1958, roughly on par with that of the United States. The United States life expectancy for women, I think these 2012 figures, was 81, and for Cuba, 80.4. To move on to the campaign against homophobia, the origins of homophobia are very much a part of our Latino culture. They go back actually to before the discovery of the New World, going back to Spanish, to the role of the Inquisition and of the Catholic Church. And the Inquisition was not just a European issue. They brought the Inquisition to the New World, including to Cuba and to my own Puerto Rico. Moving the clock really fast, in the 1930s, the government passed a public ostentation law which encouraged and supported, institutionalized the harassment of gay, lesbian, and transsexuals, bisexuals and transsexuals that were not closeted. It was an open season on the repression of anyone who dared to display openly their gay sexual orientation. And the Cuban Revolution, right after 1959, went on implementing the public ostentation law, which went through all the way to the middle 70s, as we'll see. And part of that, a sad part, a shameful part of that, to speak bluntly, a shameful part of of how the revolution went on to institutionalize homophobia were the military units to aid production. That actually, it was kind of an alternative to compulsory military service. But of course, in their misogynist and their homophobic conception, LGBT people were not deemed appropriate to be part of the revolutionary military, and so they sent these productions camps where there were small factories based in different parts in Cuba. They were not only for gay and lesbians. The military leaders, te me dijo que Raúl estuvo en uno de los campos de Lomar. Yeah, Reverend Suarez actually was interned in one of these camps as a religious leader. Other people that were deemed dissidents, or that were deemed, people that had long hair and liked rock. Also, some of them ended up in some of these UMAP camps. So this went on from 1965 and 68. But of course, when the government institutionalizes that process, it legitimizes the homophobia that continues up until today, and of which is the campaign that Evarina prepared this presentation, and will be speaking to us in more detail in just a few minutes. The government, another unfortunate episode of institutionalized homophobia again, occurred during the Mariel Boatlift. By the late 70s, Fidel had already acknowledged some of the earlier mistakes of the revolution and the open repression against gays and lesbians, transsexuals, bisexuals in Cuba. But in when the Mariel Boatlift happened, those of you who don't remember, or weren't born back then, it was a moment of much economic difficulty in Cuba, and so people tried to defect through the Peruvian embassy, and at some point the Cuban government said, anyone who wants to leave can leave. And so there were, I think about 100,000, como 100,000 fueron que emigraron. There were about 100,000 people that will leave on that Mariel Boatlift. Mariel, because it happened through the port of Mariel. But thousands of gay and lesbians in Cuba were kind of pushed out onto the Mariel Boatlift, along with others that were deemed undesirables. So Evarina didn't want to just, like we say in my country, no quería dorar la píldora. He didn't want to just sweeten the pill. He wanted to talk about, this happened too. And so that the efforts that are happening now are efforts to make amends for some of these. Evarina used a term last night that I loved. She spoke de los errores y los horrores de la revolución. The errors and the horrors of the revolution. And these, for sure, are high on the list. But in the mid-1970s, we see at first a gradual process towards more tolerance. And Evarina yesterday spoke about tolerance. It's not necessarily a desirable process. It means that you just put up with, as opposed to acceptance, which is a more recent trend. But back then it was about tolerance, and it was led again by the Federation of Cuban Women. It led to increased acceptance of homosexuality. In 1977, and this is a key step in that process, was the founding of CENESEX, the National Center for Sex Education, which seeks to encourage, among other things, a more enlightened outlook on homosexuality and to undermine traditional sexual prejudices and taboos. This is from their Declaration of Principles. An important process, in 1979, the Cuban government will remove all the homosexual acts among consenting adults from the penal code as a criminal offense. And then in 1986, an even much more substantial step in the war against homophobia, in the campaign against homophobia, will be the annulment of all remaining laws in the penal code that prohibited homosexual conduct. There'll be much greater tolerance for public displays of affection among LGBT peoples. They will actually begin to produce films and documentaries. Has anybody seen Strawberry and Chocolate? That was like in the 80s. An amazing film that is part of this wave of really making amends, of producing a new generation of films and documentaries that portray a different effort. Part of what they've done, of what CENESEX has done, is also try to influence the scripts of soaps and of other documentaries to try to effect more changes. 1990, there used to be people that tested HIV positive were segregated from the population. That will end in 1993. And at that time, that came as a result of a federation of physicians that will end the definition of homosexuality as abnormal, and will instead define it as natural variation. For those of us that grew up or live here, I happen to be a psychologist by training, and it was the same year that the American Psychiatric Association finally took off the diagnostic and statistical manual that defines, the Bible that defines what are all the mental illness, all the forms of mental illness. It was the same year that the American Psychiatric Association took out homosexuality as a form of mental illness.